So let's take a quick look at NURBS, and NURBS will allow us to add a more organic quality to some of our models. Now, to demonstrate this, I'm going to jump into a new document really quickly, and I'll generate a cube. Now, I'm going to be adding segmentation to this cube to kind of demonstrate this concept, and so whenever I'm dealing with segmentation, I always want to look at my display, change my display just a bit to make sure that I'm including lines in my view. And I'll just bump up the segmentation just a little bit. So I'll send it into 3 in all directions according to the cube. Now, there's a NURBS menu here. It's just 2 icons over from the right of the parametric primitives. And if we click and hold on the NURBS menu, you can see that we have lots of different options. These are generators. We can generate different shapes based on... So 2 icons over from the parametric primitives menu. The next icon over we have splines. We'll take a look at those a little bit later. But just to the right of the splines menu, we have our NURBS menu. And what we want to focus on is this hyper NURBS object. In fact, if I just click one time on that menu, you'll see that in the object manager it generates a hyper NURBS object. And the way that NURBS work, in the case of the hyper NURBS, you need to put a 3D model inside the object. So I'll take my cube object and I'm going to drag it up in the object manager until I see the down arrow. And that means that I'm going to nest the cube object into the hyper NURBS object, or in other words, I'll create a parent-child relationship. And so the minute I drag my cube into my hyper NURBS object, the hyper NURBS takes control of that object and applies its effect to it. And you can see that when we look in the perspective viewport, it smoothed my cube out greatly, so I no longer have these hard edges. In fact, I get a little preview of the original shape and then the final shape after the NURBS object has affected it. I'll give it a quick render so you can see it a little bit more clearly, and then I'll go back to the cube. Now, the amount of geometry in an object really determines what its shape is. And just to demonstrate this point, if I take the segmentation of this cube way down back to its original one, you'll see that it looks like it's no longer a cube at all, but it looks almost more like a sphere. And as I start to bump segmentation up in any given direction, you can see that I start to minimize the smoothing effect of the NURBS to some degree. If I take a closer look at the edge, it's just making, it's still very smooth, but it's just making kind of a tighter transition around that corner. So the amount of geometry in a model will contribute to what the model looks like, and the proximity of one edge or one point to another will help determine what the path of the smoothing will take. So basically our hyper NURBS object is this object that if we put a model inside of it, it's going to smooth it out. Now we can temporarily turn off the effect of any NURB object simply by clicking on the green check mark in the object manager. I can turn off the check mark, and now I see the original cube with all of its segmentation represented here. If I turn it back on, you can start to see the smoothing effect take control. And I'm going to use this model, or excuse me, this hyper NURBS object to add more of an organic quality to the branch that I just created. Now, before I jump back into it, I still have a previous document when I was demonstrating extrusions. And just for kicks, I'll create a hyper NURBS object, and I'll throw my cube into the hyper NURBS, and now you can see the object that I created. So it's a little kind of strange looking, but you can start to see dramatically what the effects of a hyper NURB object are on our models. So I'll just close this document without saving. I'll close this one without saving, and now I'm back into my Snowman project. I'll generate a quick hyper NURBS object. At this point too, I neglected to name the object that I'm working on, so I'll just quickly take care of that and call this branch, and I'll drag the branch object into my hyper NURBS object, and immediately you can see that I have a much different looking model based on the decisions that I made in throwing it into a hyper NURBS. Now, before I start trying to move this model around, I do recall that I'm still inside the polygon mode or the component mode of this object, and I actually have a polygon selected over here, because the last thing I did when I was in this scene was I was selecting individual polygons and edges and extrusions and scaling and doing all these things to create this shape. So I want to make sure I go back to the default toolset before I try to move anything around. And if you remember, the default toolset is this icon here on the left column, which is the use model mode or model mode. And this allows me to affect not the different individual components of a model, but the entire model itself. I also like to go back to the move tool. So I have the move tool selected, I have the model mode selected, and now I can just move this stick up where I think it should go. I'll go to rotation, and I'll rotate this in a direction, and maybe I'll do something like this, and I'll go to the move tool, and I'll just kind of move that back and stick that into my snowman. So just a real quick strategy, and now that I actually have attached it or stuck it inside my snowman, I kind of feel like I want a slightly different shape, but I'll revisit that a little bit later. For now, also what I'll do is I'll copy my HyperNerbs object with a Command C and a Command V. That gives me an exact duplicate, and I'll just take that, and you can see that my registration point for this object is kind of way off to the side. So, and I'll explain what's happening there and control that a little bit later. But I'll just move this over just a bit, and you'll see that when I rotate this, things are going to get really crazy. Just rotate. You can see that my stick object is swinging way out in space. So actually, rather than waiting to explain this, let me take the opportunity to talk a little bit about this and what's happening here. Whenever we group objects or make parent-child relationships, there's a local coordinate system and a global coordinate system. And so to demonstrate this point, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to generate a cube. I'll go to the move object. I'll move this over. And again, you don't really need to follow along by doing this necessarily. I just want to explain a concept in Cinema 4D. If I move this away from the origin, so it's away from X, Y, and Z, 0, 0, 0. I've moved it up and over in space. And if I were to group this or apply a HyperNerbs object, when I generate a HyperNerbs, and I'll select that, if I look down here, my position, my coordinate manager changed a little bit because I'm still in this model mode. When I created the HyperNerbs, it exists like any other object at 0, 0, 0. When I select my cube that I was moving around, you can see that I moved it in space. Well, the minute that I put the cube inside this HyperNerbs object, and I select the HyperNerbs object as the parent to move this thing around, you can see that the HyperNerbs still exists at 0, 0, 0, right? And because of that, its axes, or its center point, or its registration point, its axes that governs this shape is still at the origin of our 3D space, which means that any object that we nest inside of it uses this as its center point. So if we start to do things like rotate, it rotates around its center point. Okay, now we can fix this a couple of different ways. The easiest thing to do, the easiest way to fix this is that we can actually go into the cube object. So I'm actually inside the HyperNerbs, I'm selecting the cube, I'm going to the move tool, and I could manually move this back closer to the origin, or I could just actually zero out the coordinate system of that object. I'll hit apply. Okay, so I've moved the child object back to the origin, and if I select on the HyperNerbs object, you can see now that they share the same position in space, right? And this cube actually references the registration point now of its parent object. It's kind of ignoring where it's at in the world, and I'll demonstrate and talk a little bit more about this later once we get into our next project. But for now, suffice to say that you can select the child object and just zero out its coordinate system, hit return to apply in the event that the parent and the child have two different coordinates going on. Okay, so now I can select my HyperNerbs object and I can move this around, and I'll delete the HyperNerbs object, which deletes the HyperNerb and the cube, because remember, the thing that I want to do is I want to go to my branch object, and I'll just borrow that technique of zeroing out its coordinates, and I'll hit apply. And now when I select the HyperNerbs, you can see that it's sharing the same axes. I'll tap the S key really quickly, and I'll just do a quick rotation. And let's see here, I'll just do a real quick rotation. I'll go back to the move tool, and I'll move this up and over, and just kind of temporarily stick it into the side of the object. Oop, I'm a little low. Let me just take this and move it over. That looks pretty good. Pretty happy with that. Although I don't want his hands raised up. I don't think he's surrendering here. So I'll just kind of rotate. Oops. Started to rotate and had too many axes selected, so I'll just kind of rotate that back down. Now maybe my snowman is doing a little dance instead of surrendering. So there we go. That's just a real quick overview of some of the things that you can think about when creating your stick arms and making sure that they're still manageable inside this 3D space. So we'll catch up in the next presentation and add some additional detail. I'll start to think about the environment that I'm in, and then I'll do a final pass of texturing and lighting and really thinking about the composition. So we'll catch up in the next presentation.